They asked for my signature while I was still sitting at the table. Not in a hospital, not during an emergency. Right there, after dinner, in my own house. My oldest son slid the folder toward me like it was a bill. My daughter said it was just a formality. My youngest was already opening a pen. No one looked nervous. They looked organized. They talked about protection, planning, efficiency. They talked about my companies, my shares, my accounts. They didn't talk about me. I wasn't sick. I wasn't confused. I was sitting in the chair I paid for, listening to my children prepare for a future where I was a delay in the process. At one point, my son said, "This just makes things easier for everyone." Everyone. That's when it hit me. They weren't asking in case something happened. They were asking so they wouldn't have to wait. I kept my hands still so they wouldn't see them shake. In that moment, I realized something I wish I'd understood sooner. They weren't planning around me anymore. They were planning past me. And they thought I hadn't noticed.
Welcome to Life Voices, where family drama turns into late-life justice. Subscribe for more emotional family stories. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from.
I didn't sign that night. I closed the folder, set it back on the table, and told them I wanted time to look it over. Calm, polite, reasonable, the way they always taught me to be. No one argued. That's what made it feel strange. They were too understanding, too prepared for me to hesitate. My daughter said, "Of course, Mom. We just want everything to be organized." My oldest nodded like this was already settled. My youngest poured more wine, like we were still having a normal dinner. But nothing felt normal anymore. After they left, I sat in the kitchen with the papers in front of me. Same table my husband and I bought 30 years ago when the first plant opened. Back then, we were just trying to keep the lights on. Payroll came before sleep. Expansion came before vacations. Every decision was risk. Every dollar mattered. Now there were 3 plants, distribution centers, commercial leases, a holding company with our last name on the door, lawyers, accountants, a board that still called me for final approval, and suddenly my children were talking about streamlining control. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. I read. The documents were clean, professional, nothing sloppy. That was the first thing I noticed. Someone had spent time on this. Legal language, corporate structure, authority transfers that sounded temporary but weren't. They framed it as support, efficiency, protection if I ever needed help managing things. If I ever needed help. I was running 3 companies and chairing 2 boards. I wasn't asking for help. No one had suggested I was struggling. Not until that night. I made coffee and kept reading. There were clauses about signing authority, about who could act on behalf of the company if I was unavailable, about who could access certain accounts to maintain operations. It all sounded responsible, thoughtful, sensible. But the timing bothered me. My husband had been gone 8 months. Everything transferred to me cleanly. No disputes, no confusion. The lawyers had handled it years ago. The structure was solid. There was no urgency, no crisis, nothing that required late-night paperwork at my own dining table, which meant this wasn't about emergency planning. This was about positioning. The next morning, my phone started ringing earlier than usual. My oldest son called first. Casual tone. Asked if I'd had time to review things. Said there was no rush, but it would be good to have clarity. My daughter texted a few hours later, just checking in. My youngest stopped by the office with pastries and a friendly reminder that the legal team could walk me through everything. It was coordinated, not aggressive, not pushy, just steady. They were very calm about it. That calm told me more than any argument would have. I went to the main plant that afternoon, walked the floor like I always did, talked to supervisors, checked production numbers, signed off on shipments. No one treated me like I was fading. No one acted like I needed assistance managing anything. Operations were strong. Profits were strong. The company was stable. So why the urgency at home? At lunch, I sat in my office and pulled up the ownership structure. Every share, Every voting block, every trust my husband and I had set up over the years. We'd planned carefully. We'd made sure the transition would be smooth one day, but not yet. Not while I was still making decisions. I thought about the way they'd sat around the table, the way the folder had already been tabbed, the way the pen had been placed within reach. It hadn't been spontaneous. It hadn't been a suggestion. It had been a step in a process that had already started without me. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me quiet. Because anger would have given them something to respond to, something to manage, something to calm down. Quiet gives you time. Quiet gives you space to see what people do next. So I didn't confront anyone. I didn't accuse. I didn't call a family meeting. I didn't tell them what I was thinking. I watched. Over the next week, little things started to stand out. My daughter asking more detailed questions about reporting timelines. My oldest mentioning a future board restructuring eventually. My youngest talking about long-term tax strategies like they were already in motion. They were careful with their words, always respectful, always framed as concern. But the direction was clear. They were preparing for a shift in control, and they were preparing as a group. One evening, my oldest said, "We just want to make sure everything is smooth if something ever happens." If something ever happens. I nodded, smiled, said I understood. But what I understood wasn't what he meant. I understood that they had started imagining the company without me at the center, not out of malice, not out of desperation, out of assumption, out of comfort, out of a belief that the transition was already in motion. They thought they were being responsible. They didn't realize how early they were. That week, I took the folder back out and read every page again, slower this time, looking for what wasn't obvious, looking for what changed if I signed, looking for how authority would shift quietly, step by step, without anyone ever needing to challenge me directly. It was all very smart. That's what made it dangerous, because nothing in those documents screamed takeover. Nothing looked hostile. Everything looked helpful, sensible, protective, efficient. The kind of paperwork families sign when they trust each other completely. And that was the point. Trust makes signatures easy. I closed the folder and set it aside. I wasn't ready to say anything yet. I wasn't ready to reveal what I was thinking, but I was ready to understand exactly what they were preparing for. So I did what I've always done when something feels off. I stopped reacting, and I started paying attention. They thought I was taking time to decide. I was taking time to see everything. A few days passed, and no one pushed too hard. That was the first sign something was different. In our family, when something really didn't matter, it disappeared fast. When it did matter, it stayed in rotation. Gentle reminders, casual check-ins, small comments dropped into normal conversations. This stayed in rotation. My daughter called on Tuesday morning, friendly voice, asked about my schedule, then slipped in, "Did you get a chance to review those documents?" Not pressure, just presence. My oldest stopped by the office Thursday afternoon, brought coffee, sat across from me like we were discussing quarterly numbers. He didn't mention the folder right away. We talked about production, about a supplier issue, about a possible expansion. Then, as he stood to leave, he said, "No rush on the paperwork, just want to make sure everything's clear for the future." The future. My youngest texted that weekend, "We're all on the same page, Mom, we just want to help." All on the same page. That phrase stuck with me. I started noticing how often they spoke as a group, not in a confrontational way, more like a unified front, calm, organized, thoughtful, like they'd already had conversations without me, like the planning had started somewhere else, and now I was being brought in to finalize it. At dinner the following Sunday, the folder appeared again, not pushed toward me this time, just placed on the table, visible, within reach. No one mentioned it for the first 20 minutes. We talked about the grandchildren, school, travel, a new contract one of the plants was negotiating. Everything sounded normal. That was the strategy. Keep it comfortable. Keep it friendly. Keep it easy to say yes. Then my daughter said, "We spoke with the legal team about timing. They said it's better to handle things while everything is stable." While everything is stable. My oldest added, "It protects you, too. If anything unexpected ever happened, we'd already be set up to manage things without disruption." Manage things. They weren't talking about helping. They were talking about running. I nodded slowly like I was considering it, like I was weighing logistics and not implications. Inside, I was tracking every word, every glance between them, every small signal that they'd rehearsed this conversation before sitting down. They thought they were being subtle. They thought they were being respectful. They thought I didn't notice the coordination. But when you've spent 40 years in business, you recognize alignment when you see it. After dinner, my youngest walked me to the door, casual tone. "We just want to make sure everything is secure for the future, Mom. That's all." Secure for the future. I smiled and told him I appreciated the concern. What I didn't say was this: no one suddenly coordinates legal strategy across 3 households unless the conversation has already gone much further. The next morning, I went into the office earlier than usual, pulled the original corporate structure files, every version of our agreements, every trust, every transfer my husband and I had set up over the years. We'd planned carefully. We'd made sure the transition would be smooth one day, but that day wasn't supposed to be now. Control was centralized for a reason: stability, clarity, leadership. You don't build a company across decades just to hand over authority because someone thinks it's time to organize. I called our longtime CFO and asked a few routine questions. Nothing alarming, just checking numbers, authority lines, signing procedures. He didn't mention any concerns, didn't suggest I needed help, didn't act like I was stepping back, which meant the push wasn't coming from the company. It was coming from the family. That afternoon, my daughter sent another message. "Legal says we can finalize everything quickly once you sign. Just let us know when you're ready." Finalize everything quickly. Quick was the word that bothered me most. Nothing about generational wealth should move quickly, not unless someone is trying to lock something in before conditions change. I didn't respond right away. I let the message sit. I let them wonder a little. Silence makes people show their hand faster than arguments do. By midweek, the tone shifted slightly. Still polite, still calm, but more frequent. My oldest called again, asked if I wanted to review things together. My youngest offered to bring the lawyer by the house to walk me through any concerns. My daughter mentioned that delaying could complicate tax planning. Tax planning, they were building a case for urgency, soft urgency, reasonable urgency, the kind that sounds responsible, the kind that makes saying no feel irrational. I didn't say no, I didn't say yes, I just listened. And the more I listened, the clearer it became. They weren't worried about my health. They weren't worried about the business. They were worried about timing. Timing of control. Timing of authority. Timing of access. They were planning like the transition had already started. One evening, after another calm conversation about streamlining things, my oldest said something that stayed with me. "We just want to make sure everything is smooth when the time comes." When the time comes. He didn't say if. He didn't say someday. He said when. That's when the final piece fell into place. This wasn't preparation for a distant future. This was preparation for a near one they believed was approaching faster than I did. I ended the call politely, told him I understood, told him I was reviewing everything carefully. Then I sat in the quiet of my living room and looked at the folder again. They thought they were ahead of me. They thought they were planning responsibly. They thought I was taking my time to accept the inevitable. What they didn't realize was this: I wasn't deciding whether to sign. I was deciding what needed to change, and I wasn't going to announce it. Not yet. I stopped talking about the documents. That was the first change. Before, I'd respond when they asked. I'd say I was reviewing things. I'd mention I wanted to understand every clause. I'd keep it polite and reasonable. Now I just stop bringing it up. If they asked, I gave short answers, neutral, calm, still looking at it, taking my time. Nothing urgent. They didn't like that, but they couldn't argue with it. There's nothing confrontational about someone being careful with legal paperwork, so they kept their tone light, supportive, patient, too patient. The following week, my oldest asked if we could have another family meeting. He said it casually, like it was about scheduling or holiday plans. I agreed. There was no reason not to. I wanted to see how far they'd go without me pushing back. We met at my house again. Same dining room, same table, same chairs. But this time, there was no folder waiting when I walked in. They waited until after dinner. After the grandchildren left the room, after the dishes were cleared. Then my daughter placed a new stack of papers in front of me. Updated versions. Cleaner, shorter, more direct. They'd revised things. I flipped through them slowly. No one rushed me. They sat quietly watching. Calm faces, professional expressions, like we were in a boardroom instead of a family home. My youngest said, "We simplified everything, just so it's easier for you." Easier for me. I nodded and kept reading. There were still clauses about authority, still provisions for account access, still structures that shifted control in ways that sounded temporary but weren't. They'd adjusted language, tightened timelines, clarified responsibilities. They'd been working on this while I was taking my time. That told me everything. At one point, my oldest leaned back in his chair and said, "We're just trying to avoid confusion later. You know how these things get if they're left too long." Left too long. I looked up at him and realized something that changed the way I saw the entire situation. They weren't waiting for me to be gone. They were waiting for me to step aside. And in their minds, that step was overdue. That realization didn't make me angry. It made everything very clear. I wasn't being pushed out, not openly, not aggressively. I was being transitioned, gently, respectfully, efficiently, like a role that had run its course. The problem was, no one had told me the role was over. I closed the folder and rested my hands on the table, calm, steady, controlled. They were watching my face for signs, resistance, emotion, confusion, anything they could respond to. I gave them nothing. "I understand what you're trying to do," I said. "I just need to be careful." They nodded immediately. Too quickly. Relief flickered across their faces. Careful meant cooperative. Careful meant eventual agreement. Careful meant this was moving in the direction they expected. What they didn't understand was this: careful doesn't mean compliant. After they left, I didn't sit in the kitchen with the papers this time. I took them straight into my study, closed the door, laid everything out across the desk. Old agreements, current structures, proposed changes, every detail side by side. Then I started making notes, not emotional notes, structural ones. Who gains authority first? Who gains access next? What happens if I sign? What happens if I don't? What happens if something changes unexpectedly? I wasn't reacting anymore. I was mapping. Over the next few days, I watched them more closely, not in an obvious way, just paying attention. My daughter's calls became slightly more frequent. My oldest started mentioning long-term planning in casual conversation. My youngest offered to handle certain financial tasks to lighten my load. They were easing into positions, preparing for responsibility they assumed was coming. They thought they were being supportive. They thought they were being proactive. They thought I was slowly accepting the transition. I let them think that. At the office, nothing changed. I signed what needed signing. approved what needed approving, attended meetings, reviewed reports. No one there acted like I was stepping back, because I wasn't. But at home, the tone was shifting. Subtle, controlled, persistent. One afternoon, my daughter said, "We just want to make sure everything's set up so there's no chaos later." No chaos later. That word, later, was doing a lot of work. Later meant after. Later meant without. Later meant beyond me. I smiled and told her I appreciated the concern. And I did, in a way. Concern is better than indifference. Organization is better than disorder. But there's a difference between planning with someone and planning around them. They had crossed that line. That night, I sat alone in the living room and thought about the past 40 years. The first plant, the loans, the risks, the nights we stayed up reviewing numbers because one wrong move could have ended everything. My husband and I built something stable, something strong, something that lasted. We always assumed the transition would come eventually. Of course it would. That's how families work. That's how businesses evolve. But transition isn't something you rush quietly across a dining table. It's something you talk about openly, respectfully, honestly. What they were doing wasn't open. It wasn't hostile either. It was strategic, coordinated, calm. And that made it harder to confront without looking unreasonable. So I didn't confront it. I adjusted. I stopped explaining my hesitation. I stopped reassuring them. I stopped reacting to the pressure. Instead, I started thinking about control, real control, legal control, structural control. If they believed the transition was already in motion, then I needed to understand exactly what that meant for the future. Not emotionally, practically. I took the documents back out one more time and read them with a different perspective. Not as a mother, as a chairwoman. And that's when the situation stopped feeling personal and started feeling strategic. They thought they were preparing for a smooth handoff. They didn't realize the structure they were relying on could change quietly, completely, without a single argument at the dinner table. I set the papers aside and turned off the light. They believed they were ahead of me. They weren't. I didn't bring up the paperwork again, not because I'd forgotten, because I wanted to see what they would do if I stayed quiet long enough. Silence makes people reveal their real timeline. For a few days, nothing happened. Then the check-ins started again. Soft ones. Casual. My daughter asking how my week looked. My oldest mentioning a meeting with the legal team just to stay organized. My youngest offering to help review vendor contracts so I could focus on bigger things. Focus on bigger things. That phrase stayed with me. I realized they weren't trying to take everything at once. They were trying to step in gradually, piece by piece, responsibility first, authority next, access after that. It was structured, thought out, calm. They weren't planning a confrontation. They were planning a transition. The problem was, I hadn't agreed to one. I went to the main office early Monday morning and asked for copies of every current authorization on file, signing authority, voting rights, access permissions, everything. No one questioned it. I was still the one in charge. I still had final say. Nothing had changed yet. That word, yet, was the key. If I signed what they wanted, the changes wouldn't be dramatic. They'd be gradual, quiet, legal. By the time anything felt different, it would already be done. That's how smart transitions work. No big moment, no obvious shift. Just paperwork. I sat in my office and looked out over the parking lot. Employees coming in, trucks moving, operations running like they always had. Stable, profitable, predictable. There was no emergency, no instability, no reason for urgency, which meant the urgency was coming from somewhere else. That afternoon, my oldest called again, friendly voice. Asked if I'd had more time with the documents. I told him I was reviewing everything carefully. He said that was good. That was smart. That was exactly what they wanted. But his tone carried something else, a quiet expectation. like this was just a step in a process that had already been set in motion. After we hung up, I sat with that feeling for a while. They weren't trying to hurt me. They weren't trying to push me out openly. They were trying to move forward without waiting too long. In their minds, they were being responsible. In mine, they were being early. That night, I pulled out every file related to ownership and control. Not just the new documents they'd brought. Everything. Original structures, amendments, trust agreements, corporate bylaws, every piece of paper that defined who had authority and when. I wasn't looking for ways to argue. I was looking for clarity. If they believed control would shift smoothly once I signed, then I needed to understand exactly how smooth that shift would be. What changed immediately? What changed later? What couldn't be undone? Because once authority moves, it doesn't move back easily. Over the next few days, I noticed their confidence growing. Not aggressively, just quietly. They spoke about future plans with more certainty, used phrases like, when we're handling things instead of if, mentioned timelines like they were already agreed upon. They thought this was moving forward. I let them think that. I kept my tone calm, cooperative, thoughtful. I didn't resist. I didn't challenge. I didn't accuse them of anything. There's no reason to create tension before you understand the full structure of a situation, and I was starting to understand it. One evening, my daughter said, "We just want to make sure everything's stable long term." Long term. I nodded and told her stability mattered to me too. What I didn't say was this: stability doesn't come from rushing control. It comes from knowing exactly where it sits. I went to bed that night with a strange sense of calm, not because the situation was resolved, because it was clear. They thought I was deciding whether to sign. I was deciding what needed to be protected before I ever picked up a pen, and they had no idea that decision had already started. A week went by without me mentioning the documents again. That's when their tone shifted. Still polite, still respectful, but tighter. My oldest called Monday morning and asked if we could wrap things up soon. He said it lightly, like it was about scheduling, like we were just finalizing a routine task. I told him I was still reviewing everything carefully. He said he understood. Then he added, "We just don't want delays later if something unexpected comes up." Delays later. That word again. Later. Always later. My daughter sent a message that afternoon. "Legal says everything's ready whenever you are." Ready. My youngest stopped by the office midweek with coffee and a relaxed smile. He didn't mention the paperwork right away. We talked about production numbers, supply chain costs, the usual. Then, as he stood to leave, he said, "Once this is handled, everything will feel a lot more secure." Handled. They weren't asking anymore. They were preparing for completion. I kept my responses calm, measured, non-committal, still looking, taking my time. Nothing urgent. Every time I said it, I watched their reactions. Small changes. A pause that lasted half a second too long. A glance between them. A shift in tone. Nothing dramatic, but enough to confirm what I already knew. They had a timeline in mind, and I wasn't moving on it. That Thursday, I drove to the main office earlier than usual, not because anything was wrong, because I wanted space to think without interruption. I sat in my office and laid out every document again. Old structures, new proposals, authority charts, ownership percentages, voting power. Then I did something I should have done sooner. I stopped reading like a mother. I started reading like a chairwoman. If I signed what they wanted, authority wouldn't transfer all at once. It would shift gradually. Shared signatures, shared access, shared control. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational, but enough to change how decisions were made, enough to change who needed to approve what, enough to make my role lighter. That was the word they used, lighter. I sat back in my chair and thought about the past year. The funeral, the transition, the way everyone had stepped in to help. It had all felt supportive at the time, caring, responsible. Now it felt coordinated, not in a malicious way, in an organized one. They weren't trying to take anything overnight. They were trying to move into position, and they assumed I'd eventually agree. That assumption was the problem, not because they were wrong to plan for the future, because they were planning like the future had already started. I closed the folder and stared out the window for a long time. Trucks moving in and out, employees arriving for shifts, operations running exactly as they always had, stable, predictable, under control. My control. That afternoon, my oldest called again. This time his tone was more direct, still polite, still calm, but more focused. "We just want to make sure everything's set before the next quarter," he said. "It's easier to transition while things are stable." Transition. There it was. I let the word sit between us for a moment. Then I said, "I understand." And I did. I understood that they believed this was inevitable. I understood that they thought they were being responsible. I understood that they expected me to agree eventually. What they didn't understand was this. I wasn't deciding whether to transition. I was deciding how. That night, I took the documents into my study and closed the door, not to read them again. I already knew what they said. I knew what they would do if I signed. I knew how authority would shift, how access would change, how control would soften. I wasn't looking for information anymore. I was thinking about structure. If they were planning for the future, then I needed to make sure the future was structured correctly, not emotionally, legally, practically, quietly. I didn't call anyone that night. I didn't send any emails. I didn't respond to the messages waiting on my phone. I just sat in the quiet and let the situation settle into something clear and simple. They believed they were ahead of me. They believed the timeline was already moving. They believed all that was left was my signature. What they didn't realize was this. I hadn't refused. I just hadn't agreed yet. And that gave me time, more time than they thought. By the next week, the pressure wasn't louder. It was closer. More calls. More just checking in. More mentions of timing. Nothing aggressive. Nothing that would sound unreasonable if someone else heard it. But enough to create a steady rhythm. A sense that this was supposed to move forward soon. My daughter stopped by the house one afternoon with the grandchildren. We had coffee, talked about school, travel, normal things. Then, while the kids were in the living room, she said, "We just want to make sure everything's settled so you don't have to worry about anything." Settled. I smiled and told her I wasn't worried. She nodded like that was exactly why we needed to finalize things. That night, my oldest called. He didn't mention the documents immediately. We talked about the company, about next quarter, about expansion plans. Then he said, "Once the structure is updated, decisions will be a lot smoother for everyone." Structure updated. He was already speaking like it was done. I listened, agreed with the idea of smooth decisions, agreed that clarity mattered. Then I changed the subject. He didn't push, but he didn't drop it either. They were patient. Patient people are harder to confront than aggressive ones. Aggression gives you something to react to. Patience just keeps moving forward quietly. Over the next few days, I noticed something else. They started including themselves in conversations about future leadership. Not directly, not officially, just small comments. When we're handling things. Once the transition is complete. Down the road when everything shifts. It wasn't a takeover, it was a mindset. They believed it was coming, sooner rather than later. One evening, we all had dinner again. Same table, same room. No documents this time. Just conversation. Comfortable. Familiar. But underneath it, there was an assumption. A quiet expectation that the next step was already agreed upon. At one point, my youngest said, "We just want to make sure you don't have to carry everything alone anymore." Carry everything alone. I looked at him and realized they truly believed they were helping. In their minds, this wasn't about control, it was about responsibility, about stepping in, about preparing. They thought they were being good children, responsible heirs, practical adults. They didn't see the difference between supporting someone and replacing them. I kept my voice calm, told them I appreciated the concern, told them I understood the importance of planning. Everything I said sounded cooperative, reasonable, calm, because it was. I wasn't against planning, I wasn't against structure, I wasn't against the future. I just wasn't ready to give up control because someone else thought the timing made sense. That night, after they left, I walked through the house slowly. Same rooms, same furniture, same life I'd built over decades. Nothing had changed yet. Not legally, not officially. Everything still ran through me, but the atmosphere had shifted. They were preparing for the moment when it wouldn't. I sat in the study and looked at the folder again. I didn't need to read it anymore. I knew what it would do. I knew how it would shift authority. I knew how easy it would be to sign and call it responsible planning. That's what made it dangerous. Easy decisions can change everything. The next morning, my daughter texted, "Let us know when you're ready. Legal is standing by." Standing by. They were waiting for a signal, for a signature, for closure. They thought the process was almost complete. What they didn't realize was this: I wasn't waiting to decide. I was waiting for the right moment. Because once I moved, it wouldn't be a conversation. It would be done. Quietly. Legally. Completely. And they wouldn't see it coming. They believed they were ahead of me. They believed I was slowly coming around. They believed the next step was mine to take in the way they expected. They were very confident. And that confidence was going to matter. The following week felt calm. Too calm. No one pushed hard. No one demanded anything. The messages were still there, but lighter. My daughter asking about dinner plans. My oldest mentioning a board update. My youngest sending a photo of the kids. On the surface, everything looked normal. Underneath, they were waiting for me to pick up a pen. I kept my routine exactly the same. Office in the morning, plant visits, calls with management. Nothing changed on paper. Nothing changed publicly. Everything still ran through me. But privately, I stopped thinking about whether I would sign. I started thinking about what would happen next if I did. If I signed, authority wouldn't disappear overnight. It would shift slowly. Shared signatures, shared access, shared decisions. The kind of change that feels small at first, reasonable, practical. Then one day you realize the final call isn't entirely yours anymore. That's how control moves in families like ours. Quietly, legally, without confrontation. They weren't trying to take anything aggressively. They were trying to step in early, smoothly, responsibly. In their minds, this was just planning ahead. In mine, it was timing. I spent that week reviewing everything one more time. Not emotionally, structurally. I looked at ownership, voting rights, authority lines, future transfers, every path the company could take over the next 10 years. Then I stopped looking at their documents and started thinking about my own. One afternoon, my oldest called again, friendly tone, asked if I'd had more time. I told him yes. He sounded relieved, said we could finalize things whenever I was ready, said it would be good to have everything locked in. Locked in. That phrase stayed with me long after the call ended. Locked in works both ways. That evening, my daughter texted, "Let us know when you want to schedule with legal. We're all flexible." All flexible. They were coordinating schedules, preparing for a signing, treating it like a formality that just needed a date. I didn't correct them. I didn't tell them what I was thinking. I let them stay confident. Confidence makes people predictable. Over the next few days, I noticed them relaxing. Not completely, but enough. My youngest stopped by the office and talked about future plans like they were already moving forward. My daughter mentioned leadership roles more openly. My oldest talked about next steps without hesitation. They believed the decision had already been made. They just didn't know what that decision was. That Friday evening, we all had dinner again. Same table, same house. No documents on the table this time. Just conversation. Light. Comfortable. Almost easy. At one point, my oldest said, "Once everything's finalized, it'll feel good to have clarity." Finalized. I nodded slowly. Told him clarity was important. It was, but not in the way he thought. After dinner, I walked them to the door. Hugs, goodbyes, normal family moments, nothing tense, nothing dramatic. They left thinking the next time we sat down together, it would be to sign. I closed the door and stood in the quiet for a long moment. They believed everything was almost done. They believed the structure was about to shift the way they expected. They believed they were ahead of the situation. What they didn't realize was this. By the time they saw the final version of what I'd decided, it would already be complete. Not discussed, not debated, not negotiated. Complete. They thought the next step belonged to them. It didn't. And they wouldn't know that until it was too late to adjust. They thought the next meeting would be about signatures. It wasn't. My oldest called Monday morning and said legal had openings later in the week. Asked what day worked best for me. His tone was calm, confident, like this was already decided and we were just scheduling the final step. I told him Thursday afternoon would be fine. There was a small pause on the line. Relief, maybe. Then he said, "Perfect. We'll all be there." We'll all be there. That part mattered. They expected to sit around a table, slide the documents over, watch me sign, close the loop, move forward. I didn't correct him. Thursday came quietly. I went into the office in the morning like usual, reviewed reports, signed what needed signing, took a call with the plant manager. Everything normal, everything stable. By noon, I drove to the law firm, not the one they'd been mentioning. Mine, the one my husband and I had used for years, the one that knew the full structure, the one that understood how everything fit together. I'd already spent time there earlier in the week, already reviewed options, already asked questions. This wasn't a discussion anymore. It was execution. By the time my children arrived at the office they'd scheduled, I was already finished with mine. They didn't know that yet. I walked into the conference room they'd booked about 10 minutes late, calm, unhurried. They were all there. My oldest, my daughter, my youngest, their lawyer, their folders, their pens. They looked ready. My daughter smiled and said, "We've got everything prepared." I nodded and took a seat. They began explaining the documents again, slowly, carefully, like they were guiding me through something complicated. Authority transfers, future planning, shared responsibility, all the same language, all the same structure. I listened, really listened. Not because I needed to understand it anymore. I already did. Because I wanted to hear how confident they sounded, how certain they were that this was about to be finalized. At one point, my oldest pushed the folder toward me. Same gesture as before, controlled, professional, expectant. He said, "Once this is signed, everything will be set." Set. I opened the folder, flipped through the pages, let a few seconds pass. Enough to make it feel real, enough to let them believe the moment had finally arrived. Then I closed it, gently, and slid it back across the table. The room went very still. "I appreciate the effort you all put into this," I said, calm, even. "But I've already updated the structure." They looked at me, confused. My daughter blinked. My youngest frowned slightly. My oldest leaned forward like he'd misheard. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean, everything's already been handled," I said. "Legally, structurally, it's done." Silence, not loud, not dramatic, just empty. Their lawyer glanced at them, then at me, trying to understand what I was saying. My daughter's face shifted from confusion to something else. Not anger, not yet, just shock. My oldest spoke first. "Handled how?" I kept my tone steady, calm, professional, the way you speak in a boardroom when you're delivering a final decision. I reviewed everything I said. Then I met with counsel and made the adjustments I felt were necessary for the long-term stability of the company and the family. No accusations, no raised voices, no emotion, just facts. They sat there processing it, trying to understand what had changed, what it meant, what they'd missed. My youngest finally said, "We thought we were finalizing things today." "You were," I said, "just not the way you expected." Another pause. My daughter looked at the closed folder in front of me like it had suddenly become irrelevant. Because it had. The documents they'd prepared were no longer the path forward. That path had shifted quietly before this meeting ever started. I didn't explain every detail. I didn't list every change. That wasn't the moment for a full briefing. That would come later, formally, through proper channels. The way decisions like this are always communicated in families like ours. But they understood enough. They understood that whatever structure they'd been preparing for wasn't automatic anymore, that access wasn't assumed, that authority wasn't simply waiting for a signature. They understood they weren't ahead of the situation. They were behind it. I stood slowly, smoothing the front of my jacket. Calm, controlled. No anger, no triumph, just finality. "I know you were trying to plan responsibly," I said. "I've done the same." I didn't stay for a debate. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. There was nothing to argue about. The structure was already in place. By the time they realized what that meant, it was done. After that meeting, no one raised their voice. No one argued in the hallway. No one accused anyone of anything. That's not how families like ours handle decisions once they're legal. We left the office quietly. My daughter walked beside me to the elevator. Calm face, controlled tone. She asked when we could all sit down and go over the changes together, not confrontational, just careful. My oldest stood near the door with that same focused look he gets in board meetings when a plan shifts and he's trying to understand the new structure. My youngest stayed quiet, hands in his pockets, thinking. They weren't angry, they were recalculating. That's what happens when confident people realize they misread the timeline. They don't explode, they adjust. Over the next few days, the calls came. Not frantic, not aggressive, just measured. They wanted clarity. They wanted to understand what had changed, what it meant for the company, for the future, for them. I agreed to meet again, this time in my office, during the day. Not around a dining table, not over dinner, a proper meeting. We sat down together the following week. Same people, different tone. No folders being pushed toward me this time. No pens laid out in advance. Just questions. I explained the structure calmly. Not every detail, just the essentials. Authority remained centralized while I was active. Future transitions would happen, but on a timeline that protected stability. Access would come with responsibility, not assumption. Control wouldn't shift because it was convenient. It would shift because it was time. They listened. That was the biggest difference. They listened instead of guiding the conversation. My oldest asked practical questions about operations and voting rights. My daughter asked about long-term planning and continuity. My youngest asked what he could do now to prepare responsibly. That was the moment everything changed. Not because the structure was different, because the understanding was. They stopped talking like I was a step in the process. They started talking like I was still leading it. There was no apology. None was needed. This wasn't a fight. It was a correction, a reset of expectations, a reminder that planning for the future doesn't mean skipping the present. Over time, the tension eased. Conversations became normal again. Business discussions stayed professional. Family dinners felt like family dinners. The assumption that control would shift soon disappeared. In its place was something more realistic. Eventually, not immediately. One evening, weeks later, my daughter said something that stayed with me. "We just wanted to make sure everything would be okay," she said. "We didn't realize it sounded like we were moving ahead without you." I told her I understood, because I did. They weren't trying to erase me. They were trying to prepare. They just moved too early. And in families with real money, real companies, real assets, timing matters more than intention. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. The business kept running. The family kept gathering. Nothing dramatic, nothing broken. Just clearer boundaries, clearer roles, clearer expectations. I didn't take anything from them. I just stopped giving blindly. Control stayed where it needed to be, for now. The future would come when it came, on the right timeline, with the right structure, with everyone understanding how it worked. And the truth is, that's all I wanted from the beginning. Not obedience, not distance, just awareness. Because sometimes the people closest to you start planning so carefully for what comes next that they forget you're still here. If you were sitting at that table and someone slid papers toward you like the future was already decided, would you have signed? Or would you have stayed quiet long enough to understand what was really happening? I'd want to know.
Your voice matters here. Share your story below. Subscribe for more emotional family stories. Have you ever lived through something similar? Share in the comments. Your voice matters here.